Hi guys, welcome back to this chapter 5 talk through for the Sign of 4. I hope that you're all doing okay and that you're continuing to do the work that I set. There will be more work coming out across the next couple of weeks once we're back after the Easter holidays, so please be checking Show My Homework regularly. Just reflecting on chapter 4. So in chapter 4 we're introduced to the character of Thaddeus Sholto. We were shown sort of him as a character, his life, his backstory. We're given a lot of information about his father, Major John Sholto. Also alluded to his twin brother, Bartholomew Sholto. This character will feature pretty heavily in chapter 5. We found that the brothers had found the treasure. The Thaddeus Sholto wanted to give some of that treasure to Mary Morstan, and chapter 4 ends with them setting off to Podicherry Lodge, this massive mansion in the countryside that the Sholtos own, that Bartholomew Sholto is currently living at, and Thaddeus Sholto has left because of the arguments between him and Bartholomew regarding the division of the treasure. So chapter 5. In this chapter, we're going to see Podicherry Lodge. We're going to be introduced posthumously to Bartholomew Sholto. This chapter revolves a lot around the conventions of Gothic horror. We're going to see some horrific elements arise within the story. We're going to see some of the conventions regarding setting, regarding imagery, all of those kinds of things. I think really with this chapter, Conan Doyle is trying to increase the suspense by adding these elements of horror. Okay, so again, remembering the numbers, please be writing these down. This is a bit of a shorter chapter, so hopefully it won't take as long as the last one. I know the last one was a bit of a marathon. So here we go. It was nearly 11 o'clock when we reached this final stage of our night's adventures. We had left the damp fog of the great city behind us, and the night was fairly fine. A warm wind blew from the westward, and heavy clouds moved slowly across the sky, with half a moon peeping occasionally through the rifts. It was clear enough to see for some distance, but Thaddeus Sholto took down one of the side lamps from the carriage to give us a better light upon our way. Podicherry Lodge stood in its own grounds, and was girt round with a very high stone wall topped with broken glass. A single narrow iron-clamped door formed the only means of entrance. On this our guide knocked with a peculiar postman-like rat-tat. "Who is there?" cried a gruff voice from within. "It is I, McMurdo. You surely know my knock by this time." There was a grumbling sound, and a clanking and jarring of keys. The door swung heavily back, and a short, deep-chested man stood in the opening, with the yellow light of the lantern shining upon his protruded face and twinkling, distrustful eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Thaddeus. Where were the others? I had no orders about them from the master." Okay, so let's just go through this. Straight away, we're going to be dealing with Gothic tropes. Now, these are the ideas that make up a Gothic horror story. So the stories that you may have studied in Year 8, such as Frankenstein or Dracula or any of the Edgar Allan Poe stories, all of that kind of stuff, they all follow the same kind of rules. And we see some of them straight from the beginning. So straight away, Conan Doyle's using pathetic fallacy. The damp fog, the heavy clouds, things like this. So there is a slight indication through the weather that something bad is going to happen from here. But at the same time, the night was fairly fine. This is showing, they're now away from the pollution of London. The moon peeping occasionally through the rifts. The personification of the moon here. This links directly with horror stories. And we'll see the moon again as the chapter goes on. We have an allusion, a reference to light dark imagery. It's dark on the outside. Thaddeus Sholto is taking a lantern down from the carriage, and he is that light that is going to guide them to the house. So we have this idea that within this bubble of people, so Thaddeus, Holmes, Mary, Watson, we will see these light bringers that are protecting them from the darkness that is around them. Next, we have the Gothic horror trope of the big country house isolated in the middle of nowhere. You know, think about Dracula's castle, think about Frankenstein's laboratory, think about all of these things that they are big, imposing houses. And here we have Podicherry Lodge, the same thing. It's stood in its own grounds. This personifies the house, like it's standing watch, or that it is standing against something. The very high stone wall topped with broken glass, iron clamps, these all indicate that the residents of Podicherry Lodge are looking for protection. They want to be protected from the outside world, or this could be Major John Sholto knowing that at some point Jonathan Small could come to get him. So from the off, when he moves into Podicherry Lodge, maybe that's when he installs all of this protection. And we've seen this again, the clanking and jarring of keys. That indicates that there are a lot of locks on the door, that the Major John Sholto wanted to be protected from the outside world. We get the reference to yellow. We saw this with the turban. We've seen this with the light coming out of the corridor for Thaddeus Sholto's house. This repeated symbolism, I think that this indicates that there is goodness, or that some good things are going to happen. Again, it could indicate wealth. You know, that Mary Morstan arriving at this property is going to lead her onto getting some wealth. Let's move on. No, McMurdo, you surprised me. I told my brother last night that I should bring some friends. He ain't been out of his room today, Mr. Thaddeus, and I have no orders. You know very well that I must stick to regulations. I can let you in, but your friends must just stop where they are. This was an unexpected obstacle. Thaddeus Sholto looked about him in a perplexed and helpless manner. This is too bad of you, McMurdo, he said. If I guarantee them, that is enough for you. There is the young lady, too. She cannot wait on the public road at this hour. Very sorry, Mr. Thaddeus, said the porter inexorably. Folk may be friends of yours, and yet no friends of the master's. He pays me well to do my duty, and my duty I'll do. I don't know none of your friends. Oh, yes, you do, McMurdo, cried Sherlock Holmes, genially. I don't think you can have forgotten me. Don't you remember the amateur who fought 3 rounds with you at Alison's rooms on the night of your benefit 4 years back? Not Mr. Sherlock Holmes, roared the prize-fighter. God's truth, how could I have mistook you? If instead of standing there so quiet you had just stepped up and given me that cross hit of yours under the jaw, I'd have known you without a question. Ah, you're one that was wasted your gifts, you have. You might have aimed high, if you enjoyed the fancy. You see, Watson, if all else fails me, I still have one of the scientific professions open to me, said Holmes, laughing. Our friend won't keep us out in the cold now, I am sure. In you come, sir, in you come, you and your friends. And so, you know, we see Holmes using his connections to persuade someone here. Now, when focusing on this page, class is one of the big things that we've talked about before, and again, we need to think here about what does Doyle show about class through the character of McMurdo. We'll get to that. And again, how is he a stereotype of a working class man? So we start with this, the working class dialect that Conan Doyle uses for McMurdo. He ain't been out of his room today. So these little contractions, ain't, oh to be of, and today, you know, little things like that. This is very different to the way that characters such as Sherlock Holmes, Watson, Sholto, how these characters talk. You know, they use standard English, proper formal standard English. The working class characters in this book generally don't. We'll see this with other working class characters as we get on. We get a little bit about Thaddeus Sholto here. The fact that when told that he can't enter, Thaddeus Sholto is perplexed and helpless. This again backs up the idea that he's weak, he doesn't know what to do. We get a little bit about attitudes towards women, a little bit about, you know, the feeling around what a woman can and cannot do. Thaddeus says that Mary Morstan she shouldn't be waiting on a public road at this hour. This shows that Thaddeus is concerned for Mary, but it also shows that Thaddeus believes that Mary is incapable of looking after herself. It also might show that there was a lot of crime at that time, as indeed there was a lot of crime in the Victorian era. So, there's a few things we could read into that. We now see that McMurdo, he uses very simple rhetoric. These are kind of like idioms or maxims. The Victorians are really into their sayings for living your life. And Murdo kind of uses some of them here, where he says, folk may be a friend of yours and yet no friends of the master's. He pays me well to do my duty, and my duty I'll do. These are very simple attitudes to work. These aren't... He isn't questioning here. He is blindly loyal to Bartholomew Sholto, which, again, that talks about how working class people were respectful of the upper classes, did exactly what the upper classes told them to do. They knew their place. So McMurdo here is kind of showing the simple-mindedness of the working class, or at least Conan Doyle's opinion that the working class had simple minds. Here, then, Holmes, he uses his connections. He mentions the fact that he was a boxer and that he'd fought McMurdo at some point, so that McMurdo should be able to remember him. And, of course, Sherlock Holmes, according to McMurdo, is a fantastic boxer. This is just another thing to add to the list of amazing things that Holmes can do, We see that he's a great detective. We see that he's very perceptive. We see that he's written things in pamphlets. We see that he's an expert in forensics. We'll see here that he's an expert boxer. Later on, we'll see he's brilliant at chemistry. We'll see that he's great at the violin. There are so many things that Holmes can do. And I believe that this sets him up as the archetypal Victorian Superman in a way. Because the Victorians believed that, you should be expert at everything. We have, again, McMurdo thinking in the terms of a working class man, that boxing is a more useful talent than that of being a detective. He believes that being able to handle yourself physically is a really important skill. So again, that is more to do with attitudes towards the working classes, that they are interested in base, low things that aren't intellectually stimulating. This is Conan Doyle's opinion. And then Holmes uses a bit of irony here. He describes the boxing as a scientific profession. Is he being patronising? Possibly a little bit, but ironic for humour's sake. And we need to think a little bit about this. Why is Holmes comfortable around working class people? He certainly is comfortable around most people. And we'll explore that idea as we go through the book. Okay, next. Just give me a sec. Right. Hang on a second. So, very sorry, Mr. Thaddeus, but orders are very strict. Had to be certain of your friends before I let them in. Inside, a gravel path wound through desolate grounds to a huge clump of a house, square and prosaic, all plunged in shadow, save where a moonbeam struck one corner and glimmered in a garret window. The vast size of the building, with its gloom and its deathly silence, struck a chill to the heart. Even Thaddeus Sholto seemed ill at ease, and the lantern quivered and rattled in his hand. I cannot understand it, he said. There must be some mistake. I distinctly told Bartholomew that we should be here, and yet there is no light in his window. I do not know what to make of it. Does he always guard the premises in this way? Asked Holmes. Yes, he has followed my father's custom. He was the favourite son, and I sometimes think that my father may have told him more than he ever told me. That is Bartholomew's window up there, where the moonshine strikes. It is quite bright, but there is no light from within, I think. None, said Holmes. But I see the glint of a light in that little window beside the door. Ah, that is the housekeeper's room. That is where old Mrs. Bernstein sits. She can tell us all about it, but perhaps you would not mind waiting here for a minute or two, for if we all go in together, and she has no word of our coming, she may be alarmed. But hush! What is that? Okay, we'll stop there. So here we have some descriptions of Norwood House. So anything in orange, this is a description of Norwood House. And we have to be we have to be thinking about the personification of the house and how the house, again, represents a Gothic horror trope of that large, isolated mansion in the middle of nowhere. Again, thinking about why Conan Doyle uses his Gothic horror ideas, yeah, I really think it's to build suspense, mystery, and tension. So it is described as desolate, so meaning huge and empty. It is a huge clump of a house, so a nice metaphor there, describing it as kind of, it looks like a conglomeration of lots of different houses all mashed together to form this huge structure. Plunged in shadow, save where a moonbeam struck one corner and glimmered in a garret window. So here again we have light, dark imagery. This is going to be, I'm going to talk about this a lot through the whole novel. Conan Doyle uses it a lot, and we're thinking about the idea of duality when looking at light, dark imagery. You know that there are two sides to everything. So the house is massive, clearly displaying a lot of wealth, but at the same time it is empty and isolated and desolate, prosaic, all of these things. So either the house in some ways has a duality. Back with the horror, we have ideas like shadow. You know, shadow is a Gothic horror idea. Moonbeams, once again, referencing the moon, linking to the idea of, you know, werewolves, vampires, all of those horror elements. And do be aware that a Victorian audience, particularly this novel was written at the end of the Victorian era, so the audience for this book will have read Dracula, Frankenstein, those more traditional Gothic horror stories. It's gloom and it's deathly silence. So here the personification of the house, that the house is gloomy, the house itself is depressed, that there is a deathly silence around the house, showing, or at least foreshadowing, that there might be some death or loss involved with the house. We again get a little bit of description for Thaddeus Sholto. The lantern quivered and rattled in his hand. This indicates that Thaddeus Sholto is fearful. He is nervous. But at the same time, the imagery of within the darkness, a lantern shaking and rattling, this might indicate that goodness is struggling, that something bad is going to happen and it might overcome the good. In this case, that is the good of Thaddeus Sholto. We're given a little bit more about Thaddeus Sholto's backstory, particularly his relationship with Bartholomew. So the idea that he followed my father's custom. This shows that Bartholomew was greedy in the way that Thaddeus clearly isn't. You know, we talked about this last chapter. If Thaddeus Sholto has all the art and all of the tapestries and all of the paintings and is a patron of the arts, he can't be that greedy. And, you know, Thaddeus is the one willing to share with Mary Morstan. So Thaddeus Sholto, very much the black sheep of the family. That's an idea that I want to explore with some other characters later on as well. The idea that Bartholomew was the favourite son. So again, indicating that he must have been more like Major John Sholto, who admitted on his deathbed that his greatest sin in life was greed. So Bartholomew, potentially pretty greedy. Again, a reference to moonshine, more supernatural stuff, more Gothic horror stuff. We'll do this last line because that fits in with what we were just talking about. So he held up the lantern and his hand shook until the circles of light flickered and wavered all around us. Again, this is fear, weakness, the potential loss of goodness. This also fits in with Watson's description of London, you know, looking at those faces flitting from the light into the dark, into the light, into the dark. A flickering light is dark light, dark light. So again, light, dark imagery really, really being developed in this chapter. Let's continue. Miss Morstan seized my wrist and we all stood with thumping hearts, straining our ears. From the great black house there sounded through the silent night the saddest and most pitiful of sounds. The shrill, broken whimpering of a frightened woman. "It is Mrs. Bernsten," said Sholto. "She is the only woman in the house. Wait here. I shall be back in a moment." He hurried for the door and knocked in his peculiar way. We could see a tall old woman admit him and sway with pleasure at the very sight of him. "Oh, Mr. Thaddeus, sir, I'm so glad you have come. I am so glad you have come, Mr. Thaddeus, sir." We heard her reiterated rejoicings until the door was closed and her voice died away into a muffled monotone. Our guide had left us the lantern. Holmes swung it slowly round and peered keenly at the house and at the great rubbish heaps which cumbered the grounds. Miss Morstan and I stood together, and her hand was in mine. A wondrous subtle thing is love, for here were we two who had never seen each other before that day, between whom no word or even look of affection had ever passed, and yet now, in an hour of trouble, our hands instinctively sought for each other. I have marvelled at it since, but at the time it seemed the most natural thing that I should go out to her so, and, as she had often told me, there was in her also the instinct to turn to me for comfort and protection. So we stood hand in hand like two children, and there was peace in our hearts for all the dark things that surrounded us. Okay, we'll stop there. So here we start with some physical contact between Watson and Mary Morstan, and on this page we get a little bit of the development of their relationship. So Mary Morstan has seized his wrist. She's taken the first step and has initiated physical contact with Watson. This indicates their development in their relationship. Before we go on, we have some violent verbs that show their fear and show how extreme it was. So the thumping of the hearts, the straining of the ears. So it is a struggle. It is a struggle for them to cope with this. They are very, very stressed. The Great Black House, simple. You know, that another description of the Podicherry Lodge. Now we have some Gothic horror ideas here. Whimpering and shrill, broken whimpering of a frightened woman. The idea of women crying and the sound of screams. This is more horror ideas. This foreshadows that something truly horrific may be about to happen. Let's move on to this. Oh, okay, so here we have the idea that Podicherry Lodge was surrounded by great rubbish heaps which cumbered the grounds, which weighed the grounds down. To explain, so these great rubbish heaps that he's seeing all around outside, this is where the Sholtos have been digging for the treasure. So this shows that I think particularly Bartholomew Sholto is willing to ruin something that is beautiful, i.e. the grounds of Podicherry Lodge, to find some more wealth. This, again, puts him at an exact opposite to Thaddeus. Thaddeus, who is a self-confessed aesthetic, somebody who enjoys beautiful things. Surely Thaddeus Sholto would have been quite annoyed at Bartholomew destroying the grounds of Podicherry Lodge. And the fact that Watson uses the word cumbered here, that he believes that these rubbish heaps are weighing the grounds down. You know, he recognises that not only are they detracting from the monetary value of the property, but they are also detracting from the beauty of the property and weighing it down. And now we get the proper development of Watson and Mary's relationship. So Watson talks about her hand being in his, so more physical contact. He even uses the word love, which is pretty strong considering that they've only really known each other for 2 days. We have here that he's personifying their hands, that our hands instinctively sought for each other. This symbolises them going to the next level of their relationship, that they are looking to become physically involved. It also, you know, if we're thinking about linking this to other texts, the hands to hands, the Holy Palmer's kiss, all of that kind of stuff from Romeo and Juliet would be applicable here. Maybe even Conan Doyle is consciously using the same imagery to show that, you know, they're very much in love, but there's a certain amount of innocence to their love. And we see that innocence develop with the simile, like two children. So we stood there hand in hand like two children. That they are soft, they are innocent. And also, this is a nice piece of juxtaposing imagery, that there was peace in our hearts for all the dark things that surrounded us. So Watson believed that they were being surrounded by evil or definitely at least criminal intentions. Okay. So We're going to start down here. So what a strange place, she said, looking round. It looks as though all the moles in England had been let loose in it. I've seen something of the sort on the side of a hill near Ballarat, where the prospectors had been at work. And from the same cause, said Holmes, these are the traces of the treasure seekers. You must remember that they were 6 years looking for it. No wonder that the grounds look like a gravel pit. At that moment the door of the house burst open, and Thaddeus Sholto came running out with his hands thrown forward and terror in his eyes. There is something amiss with Bartholomew, he cried. I am frightened. My nerves cannot stand it. He was indeed half blubbering with fear, and his twitching, feeble face peeping out from the great astrakhan collar had the helpless, appealing expression of a terrified child. Come into the house, said Holmes in his crisp, firm way. Yes, do, pleaded Thaddeus Sholto. I really do not feel equal to giving directions. We all followed him into the housekeeper's room, which stood upon the left-hand side of the passage. The old woman was pacing up and down with a scared look and restless, picking fingers, but the sight of Miss Morstan appeared to have a soothing effect upon her. God bless your sweet, calm face, she cried, with a hysterical sob. It does me good to see you. Oh, but I have been sorely tried this day. Our companion patted her thin, work-worn hand and murmured some few words of kindly, womanly comfort, which brought the colour back into the other's bloodless cheeks. Master has locked himself in and will not answer me, she explained. All day I have waited to hear from him, for he often likes to be alone. We'll stop there. And so here again it is basically just developing the same ideas. We have the reference to the fact that the grounds were destroyed by Thaddeus and Bartholomew, that again, willing to destroy something of beauty to find the treasure. More ideas around greed. One of the main themes that we will be looking at is the hollowness of wealth. The idea that wealth brings no joy to anybody in this story. And here we have an example of two characters with more than they need, in an incredibly luxurious property, with all of these grounds, and they don't find enough joy in that to be satisfied. They need to continue looking. They need to continue acquiring wealth, and that's why it is so wrecked. We have to think a little bit about why are there so many similes. I listened to a really nice theory on similes, that authors use similes to describe things that people have never seen before. We'll see this when we get on to one of the poems in the anthology, a Ted Hughes poem, where he uses a lot of similes. I want you to think about this now. So most people wouldn't know what the massive house looked like, what the huge grounds looked like, particularly a huge grounds of a house that was all dug up. So Conan Doyle resorts to using similes to describe them, because everybody can recognise what a gravel pit looks like, for example. So then the mystery is developed further, a sudden shift in the focus. We go from the description of the house to Thaddeus Sholto in the action. And we see this through the vocabulary that is used. The house burst open, this metaphor. The door of the house burst open, that it popped, that it was urgency, that there was some violence involved. Running, his hands thrown forward, the verb thrown, showing that he is imploring, he is begging for assistance and help. The terror in his eyes. All of this works together to create panic around the scene. Again, Thaddeus Sholto uses short sentences. I am frightened. My nerves cannot stand it. All of this to increase the idea of panic, to increase the idea that Thaddeus Sholto is too weak. More description of Thaddeus, half blubbering with fear, twitching feeble face, all of that. But here we have a second reference to children and childhood, very close to the one that Watson has done. So we must consider, why has Conan Doyle put this reference to children so close to the one of Mary and Watson? Well, personally, I think that Thaddeus is a child, Watson is a child, Mary is kind of a child, but they represent different aspects of childhood. Watson and Mary, it is the innocence, the romance, the finding that relationship, and trying to get started, that element of childhood. But here we see that Thaddeus represents the weak, the scared, the terrified aspect of childhood. And by juxtaposing these, again, we kind of are introduced to some sort of duality. That childhood is a time of joy, but also a time of fear, possibly. So they go into the housekeeper's rooms. We are now seeing the further development of the house as a Gothic horror trope. So always within these big houses, there are winding corridors, lots of rooms, secret chambers, all of this kind of stuff. And we see here some of that, the housekeeper's room and the passage. Here, when the housekeeper is confronted by Mary Morstan, the sight of a woman seems to reassure her. And she uses, a God bless your sweet, calm face, linking with some sort of religion. Again, it's kind of just a saying, maybe a working class saying. The idea that Mary Morstan is able to calm her because she is a woman, that a woman can only be calmed down by a woman, these are patriarchal ideas. And the implication here is that men are above this kind of terror, superstition, and worry. Okay. So let's continue. I'll start from here. All day I've waited to hear from him, for he often likes to be alone, but an hour ago I feared something was amiss, so I went up and peeped through the keyhole. You must go up, Mr. Thaddeus. You must go up and look for yourself. I have seen Mr. Bartholomew Sholto in joy and in sorrow for 10 long years, but I never saw him with such a face on him as that. Sherlock Holmes took the lamp and led the way, for Thaddeus Sholto's teeth were chattering in his head. So shaken was he that I had to pass my hand under his arm as he went up the stairs, for his knees were trembling under him. Twice, as we ascended, Holmes whipped his lens out of his pocket and carefully examined marks which appeared to be mere shapeless smudges of dust upon the cocoa nut matting which served as a stair carpet. He walked slowly from step to step, holding the lamp and shooting keen glances to right and left. Miss Morstan had remained behind with the frightened housekeeper. The third flight of stairs ended in a straight passage of some length, with a great picture in Indian tapestry upon the right of it, and 3 doors upon the left. Holmes advanced along it in the same slow, methodical way, while we kept close at his heels, with our long black shadows streaming backwards down the corridor. The third door was that which we were seeking. Holmes knocked without receiving any answer, and then tried to turn the handle and force it open. It was locked on the inside, however, and by a broad and powerful bolt, as we could see when we set our lamp up against it. The key being turned, however, the hole was not entirely closed. Sherlock Holmes bent down to it, and instantly rose again with a sharp intake of breath. "There is something devilish in this, Watson," said he, more moved than I'd ever before seen him. "What do you make of it?" Okay, so again, on this page we're dealing with Gothic horror imagery, Gothic horror conventions, light, dark imagery. We get a little bit of the patriarchy, and then we see Holmes, for the first time in the novel, kind of a little bit lost for words. So again, so just a couple of ideas before we get started. So the lamp, I've talked about this before, this represents this light in the darkness, the good protecting the weak against evil, the truth shining through mystery and the darkness. It could be either one of those things, and I think because it is held by Holmes, again, I think it could be either one of those things. Another idea that we need to bear in mind is the idea of portals within Gothic horror stories. And I don't mean magic portals. I'm not talking about a hole literally between 2 dimensions. But in Gothic horror stories, you'll see things like windows, doors, keyholes. These all represent portals between the real world and the supernatural. Now, here we are with Bartholomew Sholto locked in a room. As we're going to find out in a minute, he is dead, very, very dead, and there is a lot of mystery and potential supernatural ideas around that death. So this keyhole that Holmes is going to look through and all of that kind of stuff is definitely going to represent a portal, a barrier between the real world where Holmes and Watson are and the supernatural world where Bartholomew Sholto currently is. Mrs. Bernstein is obviously concerned. She doesn't recognise the expression on his face. She is worried. We also find out that she's worked for them for a long time. Sherlock Holmes took the lamp. This is symbolic. Holmes is now taking the light. He's taking the goodness, and he's going to lead through this house, and he's going to find out what has happened. More description of Thaddeus Sholto. Teeth were chattering, knees were trembling, more weakness. More description of Holmes as a good detective, that he is taking his magnifying glass and he is looking for clues, all of that kind of stuff. Okay. Now this, Miss Morstan had remained behind with the frightened housekeeper. This again is kind of patriarchal ideas. Thinking about, how we could read this from a feminist perspective. Why hasn't Mary Morstan gone with them? There's no sign that there is going to be danger, that she is going to get into any trouble in any way. So why hasn't she gone? Well, that's because this kind of mystery is not the place for a woman. That Mary Morstan needs protecting from some of the more grisly elements of this story. So Conan Doyle, as the writer, Watson and Holmes as the characters, they leave her behind. It also could be she stays to help the housekeeper. She stays to try and calm her down. So maybe, disregarding what I just said, maybe Mary Morstan is performing her function as part of the team. Holmes and Watson are going to go and do the observation and the deduction and the knowledge and all of that stuff, and Mary Morstan has to calm the housekeeper so they can do it in peace. It could be either one, and these kind of perceptive interpretations are what we really need to be focusing on. Okay, Holmes advanced along in the same slow, methodical way, so again that Holmes is precise. And now a lovely metaphor that really adds a lot of Gothic horror imagery are long black shadows streaming backwards down the corridor. So the idea that they are holding the light and the front of their movement is them with the light and behind them is darkness, that they are pursued in a way by evil and by badness. All of this stuff is Gothic horror, essentially. We see that Bartholomew Sholto is protected with a broad and powerful bolt. This is also a clue that whatever has happened in this room, the room was definitely locked. Also links to the idea that Bartholomew Sholto was looking for security. He was looking for a way to protect himself from whatever was going to get him. But bearing in mind as well, just to go back a second, that Thaddeus Sholto infers that Major Sholto has potentially told Bartholomew Sholto more than he told him. So potentially Bartholomew Sholto is very aware of what happened in the Andaman Islands and what happened between Jonathan Small and Major Sholto. Now here we see Sherlock Holmes take his first confidence knock. So Sherlock Holmes bent down to it and instantly rose again with a sharp intaking of breath. So whatever Holmes has seen, he's incredibly shaken by. It's made him really, really worried. And we see this in his use of imagery next. There is something devilish in this, Watson, said he, more moved than I'd ever seen him before. The fact that here, Holmes is using religious imagery to describe what is happening. This is the man that recommended the book by Winwood Reade, that secular Bible, that Holmes is very rational. He's using this religious imagery, and this is very unusual in Holmes, and shows that he's been disturbed by what he sees, because he's almost preparing himself to believe that there is something that is unexplainable within this. And that runs very much in the face of Holmes and his logical approach to detecting. I stooped to the hole and recoiled in horror. Moonlight was streaming into the room, and it was bright with a vague and shifty radiance. Looking straight at me and suspended, as it were, in the air, for all beneath was in shadow, there hung a face. The very face of our companion Thaddeus. There was the same high, shining head, the same circular bristle of red hair, the same bloodless countenance. The features were set, however, in a horrible smile, a fixed and unnatural grin, which in that still and moonlit room was more jarring to the nerves than any scowl or contortion. So like was the face of that of our little friend that I looked round at him to make sure that he was indeed with us. Then I recalled to mind that he had mentioned to us that his brother and he were twins. "This is terrible," I said to Holmes. "What is to be done?" "The door must come down," he answered, and springing against it, he put his weight upon the lock. It creaked and groaned, but did not yield. Together we flung ourselves upon it once more, and this time it gave way with a sudden snap, and we found ourselves within Bartholomew Sholto's chamber. It appeared to have been fitted up as a chemical laboratory. A double line of glass-stoppered bottles was drawn up upon the wall opposite the door, and the table was littered with Bunsen burners, test tubes, and retorts. In the corners stood carboys of acid in wicker baskets. One of these appeared to leak or to have been broken, for a stream of dark-coloured liquid had trickled out from it, and the air was heavy with a peculiarly pungent tar-like odour. A set of steps stood at one side of the room in the midst of a litter of lath and plaster, and above them there was an opening in the ceiling. Okay, we'll continue. So now, the green here, we are once more developing Gothic horror conventions within the finding of Bartholomew Sholto. But we start with a little bit of Watson's reaction. He recoiled in horror, recoiled that he was so shocked he had to pull back. Again, we see moonlight streaming into the room, bright with a vague and shifty radiance, so that the moon made it look like the things in the room weren't real, or that there was no definition to the things in the room. The vague and shifty radiance, that is. So looking straight at me, suspended as it were in the air. So this is describing this face is like a ghost. It looks like the face is hanging in the air because of all of the darkness within the room. Hung, the use of the verb hung, we've got to think about that. There are connotations around death, execution, suicide, all of that stuff around the word hung, very deliberately chosen, I think, by Conan Doyle. The very face of our companion Thaddeus. So we have here doppelgangers or mistaken identity. This is another Gothic horror trope. The idea of seeing someone and they're not the person you think they are. Think about The Picture of Dorian Gray, whether you've studied that. Think about Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. All of these things feature mistaken identities or doppelgangers. We now have this juxtaposition used to describe Bartholomew Sholto's face. A horrible smile. And you could almost say that's an oxymoron. The idea that it looks like he is happy, but also he is dead, which makes the image even more disturbing. If this was just a dead face hanging in the air, then, Holmes and Watson, they've seen dead faces. But to see a smiling dead face, as if the person was happy about what happened, that is particularly unnerving. And Watson goes on to say that. However, through all of this Gothic horror imagery, all of this supernatural foreshadowing, Watson remembers that Thaddeus and Bartholomew were twins. So this, I think, foreshadows the idea that regardless of how strange and supernatural the situation is, there is always an explanation. And even in this instance, Watson is able to put aside his supernatural concerns and recognise that Bartholomew and Thaddeus were twins. So that explains at least why they look the same. And just to sort of underline all of this Gothic horror stuff, when we've talked about Victorian fear in the past, we've thought about Victorian fear of class, we've thought about Victorian fear of the colonies, but the Victorians were a very superstitious people. Arthur Conan Doyle was not. Famously, he was friends with... Or was he? I can't remember. I'll research it and come back to you in class. Okay, maybe that's something you could do to research. He was friends with Houdini, and one of them was and one of them wasn't. And I can't remember whether Houdini was supernatural and Conan Doyle wasn't. I think actually Conan Doyle was a spiritualist who was in some way supernatural, or believed in the supernatural. But the Victorians on a whole, they did believe in the supernatural, and they did believe in ghosts and things like that. So I think here Conan Doyle is using this Gothic horror imagery to try and communicate directly with his Victorian audience. Now here's a nice moment for Holmes and Watson, and I think that this is symbolic of their relationship, how they managed to get this door open. Holmes solely against the door is unable to open it, but Holmes and Watson together, working as a unit, are able to take the door down and get into the room. This is very much their relationship. I don't think that on his own Holmes could solve the cases, for reasons we'll get into towards the end of the novel. On his own, Watson wouldn't be anywhere near solving these cases. But together, they're able to go out and do amazing things. And I think that the symbolism of together we flung ourselves upon it and once more, and this time it gave way with a sudden snap. That when Holmes and Watson work together, they are a force that can do things. We now have more reference to Gothic horror tropes, so the mad scientist trope, the laboratory trope, the Frankenstein, the Jekyll, all of these things refer to Bartholomew Sholto, and a little bit of detail about where the treasure was found, so the hole in the roof. Okay. So let me just go back. So an opening in the ceiling large enough for a man to pass through. At the foot of the steps, a long coil of rope was thrown carelessly together. By the table, in a wooden armchair, the master of the house was seated all in a heap, with his head sunk upon his left shoulder and that ghastly, inscrutable smile upon his face. He was stiff and cold, and had clearly been dead many hours. It seemed to me that not only his features, but all his limbs were twisted and turned in the most fantastic fashion. By his hand upon the table there lay a peculiar instrument, a brown, close-grained stick with a stone head like a hammer, rudely lashed on with coarse twine. Beside it was a torn sheet of notepaper with some words scrawled upon it. Holmes glanced at it and then handed it to me. "You see," he said, with a significant raising of the eyebrows. In the light of the lantern I read, with a thrill of horror, "The sign of fall." "In God's name, what does it all mean?" I asked. "It means murder," said he, stooping over the dead man. "Ah, I expected it. Look here." He pointed to what looked like a long dark thorn stuck in the skin just above the ear. "It looks like a thorn," said I. "It is a thorn. Let me pick it out. Be careful, for it is poisoned." I took it up between my finger and thumb. It came away from the skin so readily that hardly any mark was left behind. One tiny speck of blood showed where the puncture had been. "This is all an insoluble mystery to me," said I. "It grows darker instead of clearer." Let's just go through this then. So, the master of the house, Bartholomew Sholto, obviously. Again, the ghastly, inscrutable smile. The ghastly smile, another nice juxtaposition. These are all details of his corpse. The idea that his limbs were twisted and turned in the most fantastic fashion. All of this adds to the mystery. A dead body is obviously a dead body. But a dead body with a smile and its limbs all twisted and turned in strange ways. How did that happen? That's the mystery. And here we have some clues. The brown close-grained stick with a stone head like a hammer. This is an indigenous person's weapon. As we'll find out later, this is Tonga's weapon. And again, we are referred to the sign of fall. And again, Jonathan Small's handwriting described as scrawl, furthering the idea that he is working class, lower educated, all of that kind of stuff. Watson here, in absolute panic. In God's name, what does it all mean? So Watson incredibly confused. Holmes not so confused. We have the dart, the long dark thorn stuck in the skin above the ear. This again links to hints of Victorian fear about colonialism. The idea that Bartholomew Sholto has been murdered by an exotic foreign weapon speaks to the Victorians who would be worrying about the similar thing happening to possibly family members over in India and Africa. Holmes here uses observation and deduction. So he has observed that this thing is sticking in Bartholomew Sholto, and he has deduced that if Bartholomew Sholto is dead, the thing must be poisoned. I'm going to use these, particularly across the next chapter. We're going to think about observation, deduction, and knowledge, and how Holmes uses those three things to be such a good detective. Watson here showing that he is more confused, that as the case progresses, it becomes more and more insoluble. It becomes more and more difficult for him to work out what's going on. And he even uses that light dark imagery here. It grows darker instead of clearer. He believes the mystery is intensifying. He believes that they are losing, that they are becoming more disconnected from the case. Because he can observe and deduce that the dark killed Bartholomew, but a lack of knowledge means he still doesn't know what has happened, really. He doesn't understand these weapons in the same way that Sherlock Holmes does. On the contrary, he answered, it clears every instant. I only require a few missing links to have an entirely connected case. We had almost forgotten our companion's presence since we entered the chamber. He was still standing in the doorway, the very picture of terror, wringing his hands and moaning to himself. Suddenly, however, he broke out into a sharp, querulous cry. The treasure is gone, he said. They have robbed him of the treasure. There is the hole through which we lowered it. I helped him to do it. I was the last person who saw him. I left him there last night, and I heard him lock the door as I came downstairs. What time was that? It was 10 o'clock, and now he is dead, and the police will be called in, and I shall be suspected of having had a hand in it. Oh, yes, I am sure I shall. But you don't think so, gentlemen. Surely you don't think that it was I. Is it likely that I would have brought you here if it were I? Oh dear, I know that I shall go mad. He jerked his arms and stamped his feet in a kind of convulsive frenzy. You have no reason to fear, Mr. Sholto, said Holmes, kindly, putting his hand upon his shoulder. Take my advice and drive down to the police station to report this matter to the police. Offer to assist them in every way. We shall wait here until you return. The little man obeyed in a half-stupefied fashion, and we heard him stumbling down the stairs in the dark. So we start here with a very obvious difference between Holmes and Watson. Watson uses the metaphor that the case... Come on. Sorry. That the case, Watson says that the case is getting darker every minute. Holmes here says it clears every instant. So Holmes is able to understand the case as he has knowledge, as he has his wealth of understanding about everything in the world. However, the fact that they had almost forgotten their companion's presence and that they're just talking about the case, this shows that Holmes and Watson are able to move past the supernatural feelings quickly. This shows that they are professional detective people. Here we have more description of Thaddeus Sholto, more description of his reaction, and I would say definitely when if Thaddeus Sholto were to come up as a question, this is kind of the last big description of Thaddeus that we see. As with all literary characters, you need to think about change. You need to think about how Thaddeus Sholto has changed when we first saw him at the beginning of last chapter to how he's behaving now at the end of this chapter. So they think that maybe Thaddeus was calm when he was in his own little apartment, that he was kind of interested in the beauty and all of that kind of stuff. Whereas now we have fear, we have panic, worry, concern. We see Thaddeus Sholto being stretched to his limit by what is going on, particularly with his worry around the police. And I think that one thing that remains for Thaddeus Sholto through all of his descriptions is his mistrust of the police. So you could talk about his changing attitudes, his changing moods, but also talk about how his attitude towards the police is permanent. And we see this here. He worries that as he was the last person who saw him, that he's going to be a suspect. He worries that the police aren't going to take this seriously and that they're going to try and frame him instantly because, look to the last person who saw a murdered person, they surely must be a suspect. And again, he mistrusted the police here. He believes they will be called in. He should be suspected of having a hand in it. Of at least being involved, whether he did the murdering or whether he had hired someone to do the murdering. And he appeals to Holmes and Watson here. Surely you don't think that it was I? And that he says, I know that I shall go mad. if he is suspected and arrested. We see finally, him jerking his arms, stamping his feet, convulsive frenzy. Thaddeus is losing control. A convulsion is when your body moves without you being in control of it. So this shows again, where Thaddeus says that his nerves are weak, that his constitution is weak. This is the end result of it. He's presented with a stressful situation, and emotionally and physically, he cannot cope with it. Holmes, however, recommends that he go to the police. He understands that honesty is the best policy, and that all Thaddeus Sholto needs to do is the right thing. Because in Holmes's mind, facts and reason will come out in the end. This may be a little bit naive of Holmes, as we will see Thaddeus Sholto arrested in the next chapter. Okay, so that's chapter 5, guys. I'll put this out as quick as possible. You just need to keep working on it. Okay, I hope that this has been useful. Apologies for any of the blanks, things like that. It is a bit difficult to do, and I'd had a little break before I did this video, so my mind wasn't necessarily totally in it. But next one, we'll be back on track. Okay, I hope you're all doing well, and I'll speak to you all in a bit. Bye.